This fall, I was reading a book by an Irish author called Pádraig Ó Tuama. And his book, In the Shelter, is kind of part poetry collection, part spiritual autobiography, part description of how he tried to run away from all of the negative messages he had received about God, about religion, about the church, and part the recognition of how God's truth and love kept breaking in across all of those awful messages to meet him wherever it was he would try to go. Now, there's a really interesting part in this book where he talks about the importance of Christian testimony, how important it is in the life of faith for us to tell our stories of faith. But he notes that doing so is tricky. Now, one of the difficulties that he identifies in terms of how we share our stories of faith is that there can be a tendency for my experience of how God meets me to shut down your experience of how God meets you. And I can say that in my time in parish ministry, I've heard this a lot. I've heard a lot of people identify a sense of frustration, struggle, even like a feeling of inadequacy, that their faith life, their relationship with God, their prayer life doesn't match up with what they think it's supposed to look like, what other people report their faith lives and prayer lives look like. So I think he's absolutely right that this can be one of the risky things about testimony. But I think that there are some other things that are risky about testimony as well. I think that sometimes it can feel really risky to tell our story of faith because we don't want people to think we're crazy. And I think sometimes it can be really hard to tell our story of faith because we're kind of in the shadow of all of the ways in which testimony has kind of been used as a browbeating, a way of pressuring other people into believing like we do. We don't want the good news to become the you better believe or else news. And so sometimes it's easier just to consider faith to be a private matter, something that we keep to ourselves. The other thing, though, about why it's difficult to talk about our stories of faith is because it's difficult to talk about our stories of faith. It's sometimes hard to find the language to express the inexpressible. And the other thing is that sometimes it's hard to even notice the God who's right there in front of us. Faith is kind of a muscle that we have to build. It helps to practice the life of faith because the thing is that the fingerprints of God are smudged all across our lives. But we do sort of have to build the capacity, build those spiritual muscles to have our eyes open and our ears open and our hearts open to be able to see the God who is in our midst. Now, having identified some of the reasons why it can be tricky to tell our faith story, it's also important to say that it is essential to share our faith story. And I could give you a lot of reasons why that's so important, why it's so important to be able to testify, to bear witness to how God has been at work in our lives. But let me just try on one of those reasons for size this morning. One of those essential reasons why testimony is so important is because for the vast majority of us, we need to be introduced to Jesus through somebody else's story. That is to say that, yes, there were those who 2,000 years ago walked along the shores of the Lake of Galilee with Jesus, with the flesh and blood Jesus. And here and there across history, there have been people like the Apostle Paul who have had those really clear-cut, jaw-dropping experiences of seeing and hearing the risen Christ. But most of us get introduced to Jesus by somebody else sharing their story. And so if we have experienced that it is life-giving and liberating and that it brings healing and love into our lives to learn to walk with Jesus, and through Jesus to meet the God who wants to know and love us and who wants to be known and loved by us. If any of us have experienced how that is important and powerful, then our stories matter. Which brings us to the third Sunday of Advent, where I'm going to say that that point is absolutely driven home. Now, I can say that in the past, I have found it a bit weird that here we are on the third Sunday of Advent. We're like 11 days away from Christmas Eve. And still in our scriptures, we're not hearing even a whisper about Mary, Joseph, shepherds, angels, Bethlehem, babies. There's nothing. We are still in this holding pattern, stuck out in the wilderness with John the Baptist. And yet, the gospel passage that we just heard read helps us to understand why it is that we have to take this circuitous route to Bethlehem. Now, this is from the first chapter of the Gospel according to John. And the first chapter of the Gospel of John does have in it words that we often read at Christmas. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We have all of these beautiful, poetic, sweeping verses that tell us about how and why the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then right smack dab in the middle of all of that beautiful poetry, John the Baptist pops up. This passage that we just read is right in the middle of all of that well-known poetry. In fact, all four gospel accounts of Jesus' life are totally consistent in introducing us to Jesus by way of other people. So the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Mark introduce us to Jesus by way of John the Baptist. And then in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew, we get these long genealogies telling us all about Jesus' relatives. And we get Mary and Joseph and Zechariah and Elizabeth and Simeon and Anna and a whole bunch of other characters that help to lay the groundwork for us to meet Jesus. I think what this passage in particular does so well is that it tells us so clearly that a key ingredient in how the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us is us. Is those who have a witness, a testimony, a story to tell. And so here's John the Baptist with his story, and we hear that there are leaders and teachers from across the whole region, and they come to John the Baptist in the wilderness. They can see that something is going on with this guy. And they come to him with this burning question: is it you? Are you the one who we are waiting for? And John's testimony in response is really simple, and I think it's really surprising. His testimony is this: it's not me. That's his testimony. It's not me. Keep looking. But keep looking. Because the God who draws near, the God who dwells among us, is right here at hand. So keep looking. I think that simple testimony, it's not me, maybe gives us a template for how we can consider our testimony and our faith stories. Because what I hear in John the Baptist is I hear the starting of a testimony that makes room for others, that invites, that doesn't browbeat, and also that provides a building block, a starting point for how we might build that muscle of faith, how we might build the capacity to notice, to see, to perceive those fingerprints of God smudged all across our lives. Now, I started off by talking about one author, Padraig Ó Tuama, and I want to wrap up by talking about another author, C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is really well known for the Narnia books, but he's also a famous Christian apologist. That means that he has written a lot of material to present a compelling, rational, reasonable case for the Christian faith. But I think one of his most interesting books is his spiritual autobiography. And in that book, he describes his own journey from being a very fervent atheist to becoming a very outspoken Christian believer. His autobiography is called Surprised by Joy. And he identifies joy as what leads him to believe. Now, his definition of joy is very much in line with John the Baptist's testimony. It's not me. Look beyond. C.S. Lewis describes joy as a signpost, as a pointer to something other or outer. He talks about joy as not something that we ourselves can possess or generate, but as a desire, a longing, a pull toward something longer ago or further away or still about to be. That's his poetic way of describing joy. And what I hear in that description of joy is I hear that place that we can come to in our lives of recognizing our own limitations, our human limitations, and looking up and looking out and looking beyond. So joy is that place that we can come to when our rational mind can't explain anymore, and we have to embrace with awe and wonder the mystery around us. And joy is that place that we come to when we recognize that all of those things that we're taught to want, all of those material possessions that we're told are going to make us okay, of recognizing that it doesn't fill us up and that we're ready to look for something more. And joy is that place that we come to when we realize that we have experienced love and healing and peace and strength that hasn't come from my own self, that has come from beyond, from other. And joy is that place that we come to when we've been searching and suddenly we realize that the one that we've been searching for is actually been searching for us and is right there. And joy is that freedom of surrender, of realizing I can't do this alone and I don't have to. And I'm ready to be held in the loving embrace of God. Here we are on this third Sunday of Advent, the Sunday of joy, Gaudete Sunday. Let us rejoice. And we get to hear again that testimony of John the Baptist, that joyful testimony. It's not me. Keep looking beyond. And maybe in that testimony, we can hear that invitation to consider our own testimony, our own faith stories. Where have you experienced that human limitation, that beauty, that freedom of your own limitation, and where have you looked up and looked beyond? And are you willing to share that story? Amen.